And hello again, boys and girls. Welcome back to the channel. It's of course your host Marley Startled. Now let me just turn on the audio music for you. Oh, it's already on. And I am back. I've just been away on holiday for a bit. I've now come back, and I've been playing a bit of Victoria 3 offline. I played a bit of Japan, a bit of Austria, so we're going to do some art action reports for those. I also know there's a couple new games coming out soon or new expansions, so things to look out for, which you may see on my channel at a later date, is the playthrough for Unity Command 2, the Desert Fox campaign, which has just been released. Well, it's going to be released, I think, the 8th of December. The Callisto Protocol, which I probably will record offline, and the new missions, the new expansion, Scorched Earth, for Cold Harm's Gates of Hell. But you aren't here to see that. You are here to see, of course, the After Action report for Japan. So I played a bit of Japan offline and did a bit of recording when I was at home. And this is the end product, our lovely looking Japan. So Japan is a very interesting nation because if I just go up to performance mode so you don't get that much lag, because it starts off with a very conservative government and very conservative nation. It still has serfdom enforced and it is currently in isolation. Now, an interesting thing about Japan is that even though it is in isolation, it has a lot of basic resources in order to be fairly self-contained. It has some whaling for basic oil towards the mid to late game. It has enough coal to last you to the mid to late game, along with iron deposits and a lot of luxury goods. If we take a look at our luxury goods, we have things like cotton, silk plantations, dye plantations. So it's very possible to be a fairly self-contained nation until the mid-game. But the things that are restricting your ability to sort of expand or to sort of build to explode economically is your lack of free trade, which means, of course, you really just have to maintain yourself until free trade comes along. You're also fairly vulnerable to the major powers at early on, who may want to sort of open up your markets or puppet you in order to obtain that sort of special blend of bonus resources, all that sort of luxury goods which Japan can produce. This means that you've got really a good decision or two choices whether or not you can be a self-contained nation, really self-sustainable, or whether or not you want to join a customs union and grow up that way. So one game I played as Japan and joined the Austrian customs market, and I exploded this way, selling those luxury goods, selling the luxury silk, dye and whatnot to the Austrian market. But this game, I decided to be fairly self-contained, and I only recently went to sort of laissez-faire interventionism, sort of mercantilism trade towards the end once I was beginning to run out of resources. So the big limitations of Japan is initially it has a very closed economy, meaning that any deficits you will feel the pain of. You will need to really feed, clothe, and support your industries by yourself early on. You won't be able to be able to rely on other nations to get that sort of excess to fill your deficits, meaning that early on you're a very secular economy of building tools, iron, wood, and clothing fabrics and so on and so forth. So it's a very interesting game where you actually do feel the pain of not having a certain resource, meaning that as opposed to other nations that have, say, mercantilism, you may not notice you have a deficit until a war starts or until you get embargoed, and that's when the chickens come home to roost for your industries. Whereas in Japan, your industries are instead, you will feel the pain because there will be no one trading with you early on. Now, there's several ways to sort of open that up. You can either sort of wait until, say, another nation or another great power declares war to open up your markets, or you can, of course, begin to sort of liberalize. Now, the liberalization extremely difficult with the shogun being an extremely strong, extremely volatile, major political power in your nation, and that can, of course, lead to rebellions or revolutions if you try and reform too quickly. Now, my first mistake as Japan was using my political power to suppress the shogun while building up slowly. And this didn't really do anything because the suppression wasn't enough to push through these liberalizing reforms. Instead, what I had to do was build up my industry and then change the demographics naturally through industrialization that would in turn weaken the shogun. And it wasn't really until sort of the later periods of sort of the 1900s or the 1890s I was able to expand and really begin getting these liberal policies. Now, of course, one way of going about it is instead having a civil war, and that instead allowing you to push through your reforms. But if you want to play sort of more historically and get that sort of target of a peaceful revolution, then you will have to organically build up your industries and change the demographics that way. It has a very healthy population early on, Japan does, so it can mostly fill out its jobs, but it has a limited education system early on, which is gate kept by the sort of religious political party figures, and means that again you can have a very slow liberalization process until sort of mid game. At the same time, you can have the Russians trying to move in and colonizing Hokkaido and Sakhalin, meaning that that's sort of your mid-game target. So of course, it's a nation with certain targets. Like Prussia has certain targets where Prussia can, of course, firm Germany and then expand that way. Japan has certain targets, which is of course liberalize, industrialize, push out the Russians from Japanese territory, and then of course expand into the Pacific and China. So it's a nation of interesting targets which you can set for yourself. So what I did was, again, I focused on a very secular economy early on of heavy consumption taxes before eventually beginning this sort of circular industrialization of tools, wood, iron, basic clothing. I didn't really focus on the luxury goods until sort of the mid to late game. So basic clothing, basic glass, basic paper, and meeting those demands when I needed to. Then of course this would eventually expand and explode, and whenever my market access got too low in certain areas, I would then of course research the infrastructure increasing sort of tech, and of course railways and ports. But of course, that was early on. So let's talk about our certain government and politics. So we can see here, I've gone down to landed voting, and I was able to sort of reduce the shogunate, or well, completely wipe out the shogunate peacefully because it became too weak. Because as you can see, the industrialists start taking a large amount of political clout along with the trade unions once you begin to industrialize. So if you want to liberalize, I would recommend not really wasting your political power on suppressing the shogun, because you need the shogun in your government to actually do the early game reforms. Instead, you should do the early game reforms you can get away with, and then once you've got a high enough organically created sort of industrialist party, begin pushing through the reforms without having to waste your authority. Instead, you should use your authority for consumption taxes to get the money you need to increase construction. So, as you can see, we've gone to sort of a more liberal government through that sort of organic building. And of course, our laws early on was the initial rush for colonial resettlement, which you can get away with early on. We can also get away with a professional army pretty early on before any revolutions occur, before any political parties get too upset. So you can get these two, and then you can rapidly go for Hokkaido, and you can go for Sakhalin. I also did a little bit of colonialization over here, but again, I don't think you'd be able to get away with this in most games because you'd get bullied by the rest of the greater powers. And of course, towards the mid game, I was going for extra resources. You do feel the coal burn or the coal deficit towards the mid late game. So here's an expansion for coal, and I think for oil as well in sort of Borneo in this area, and rubber. So these are sort of strategic resources you will be struggling to get hold of with a sort of isolated Japan towards mid game, which you can fix by free trade, customs unions, or by aggressive expansion into this territory. So from there, once I'd done, of course, that sort of thing, I then just really just picked and choose what I could get away with. Now, one thing you can do if you are struggling to get enough political parties happy to push for another reform was to push towards landed voting, which of course means that you get about 3 political parties that are happy with you, which then means you can pass another law, which you'll probably get away with, and so that makes things a bit easier. Right now, the radicals are pretty high, but I think that's because I was trying to pay off my deficit of high taxation, because I just fought a rather expensive war over in, I think it was over in Persia, because the Russians declared war on me, and oh no, it was China. I invaded to take Beijing, which of course was causing a bit of a problem. So I'm having to pay off my debts towards the end of 1935, fighting the Chinese against for access to their coal and resources. And you can see I'm incorporating, so that's why my bureaucracy is so high. So I just fought this war, I'd taken this territory. So the early game is pretty isolated. You're just building up, doing a little bit of colonization. You can get away with it, and maybe trying to get Bully to take some of that gold reserves in Borneo. If no one can declare war, you have to be rather opportunistic as Japan early on, and hope that people give in because your army is extremely weak early on, and you may not even get effective landings. So I really struggled to land in Persia because I'd have naval superiority, but I couldn't actually get the landing bonuses to take the objective. So it was about 10 years of failed naval invasions before I got lucky and was able to take a position. So once you get to that stage, of course, you then set about liberalizing, and once you get your liberal reforms through, you've got a certain of events that you can then push through to get the Mayo Restoration, I believe. And then, of course, once that's done, you can do expansion for basic resources, pushing the Russians out to become a recognized power, which I did in conjunction with the Netherlands because there was a great power play, and that allowed me to declare war on the Russians and push them out, take Sakhalin, take Hokkaido, and become a recognized power. From there, it became a case of gradual expansion where I could get away with potentially not getting too high in infamy. You can see I've sort of had to stop expansion because of infamy, and I was pushing into China, not really for anything too important. I think there was some gold over here I wanted, some gold mines, and I believe there was some coal over here I wanted towards the end of the game. So if we take a look, was there any coal? Yeah, there was some coal here which I wanted, but I didn't want to have border gore, so I was taking this sort of together. I had a bit of a problem trying to take Joseon because it was initially a tributary of China and I couldn't transfer tributary status to me. So I had to first fight to liberate Joseon, and then I was in the process, if the game hadn't ended, with of course conquering and puppeting Joseon afterwards. So I was trying to get historic sort of 1936 borders towards the end, which I sort of scuffed up. But hey ho, it is what it is. From there, it became a case of sort of that industrialization, that sort of militarization, education, and increasing my sort of legislation to boot. So again, the more liberal you are, the better you tend to be because you've got more people in the workforce and so on and so forth. So I made sure, because it's very easy as Japan to end up in a deficit. It's a bit different to other nations because of your debt to asset ratio is so bad as an isolated nation that you can't really deficit spend as much. And if you do over deficit spend, then you end up in a death spiral where you can't afford to pay off your debts and you keep going bankrupt and you have revolutions. So really economically, it was a case of living within my means, making sure I had a bit of gold reserve until the end of the game where I could get away with raising taxation and of course deficit spending for mostly wars. Really, most of my deficit spending was based on wars rather than trying to deficit spend to industrialize. So it's an interesting nation in that regard because you don't really just mass deficit spend like you do as Britain or France. You've got to live within your means early on with that sort of 5k limit on how much debt you're allowed to go into. From there, of course, I moved up to mercantilism towards probably a late game. Really, I didn't try and do any of these. I didn't really try to move to interventionism or mercantilism until I had the Meiji Restoration or Meiji Restoration, because then that gives me a sort of events that push me towards becoming a more open nation. If I do it too early, then what happens is I get too much revolution. Same thing with wage subsidies. I kept clear of that until I was becoming more self-sustainable and industrialized, because if I did it too early, you would end up in a death spiral. And so eventually liberalization did occur, but it was a gradual organic process. I didn't try and artificially push liberalization because in doing so, I ran the risk of revolution and unrest. So, take a look at our laws. We can see we've gone to pretty much a liberal policy. We've still got a monarchy, and we now have landed voting. We've been able to push through multiculturalism and freedom of conscience. Serfdom was an important one I wanted to get done. So one of the big focuses I did early on was trying to abolish serfdom, which I was able to do, luckily. Really, it is really a case of seeing of how far you can get away of doing these liberal reforms. But my main focus was colonialism, and then of course professional army, and then abolishing serfdom, and of course education towards the end of that. and that meant that I could eventually start educating my population and improving the quality of life. You can see I have a lot of radicals, I suspect, because the population of these nations, yeah, I've got 11 million people living in southern Manchuria, uh, Beijing, and Shenyang. So obviously, you're going to have a lot of radicals from occupation. But really, it's a constant battle with the shogunate, trying to really just sort of get legislation pushed through with the shogunate in government. So I try to push legislation through with the shogunate in government because that's when I'd have the most legitimacy. I don't have any legitimacy right now, but I don't care because it's towards the end of the game. But really, the big rookie mistake is trying to push legislation without the shogunate in government. If you do that, it's going to take you decades to get any laws passed, and you will probably have revolts or threats of revolution. Instead, you need a shogunate in government, and then once a shogunate is in government, you pick another minor party like the intelligentsia or say the industrialists, and then you pass legislation with those two in government to again actually get the laws pushed through. You can't really suppress the shogunate and then try and pass legislation with the shogunate as the opposition because you won't have enough legitimacy and you'll have constant threats of unrest and civil war. You can see I've reduced my colonial affairs to 0 because there's no more colonies I want, and I increased social security a little bit, but my main effort was education, so I always tried to have education as hard as I could afford, and then of course law enforcement as hard as I could afford as well to reduce radicals and reduce the threat of revolution. Now, the health system, home affairs, all that sort of stuff, I picked because I had the money to do so. But your main ones are education and law enforcement. And if you can change the law enforcement to away from the shogunate favored law enforcement, then try and get away with it. But if you can't, then ignore it and organically change it when you feel the need of. And the main effort was colonial affairs, followed by education, followed by law enforcement. And that kept the radicals low, allowed me to colonially expand, and allowed me to educate, to do research, to stay sort of relevant industrially and militarily self-sustainable. In terms of budget, you can see I'm making 1.71 million. If I expanded, I'd make 474k. But because of the nature of Japan, you've got to be very careful with your finances. You're not going to be getting grain that's going to reduce the cost of grain from free trade or from other markets because you're isolationist. And so the big thing was trying to make sure I had enough, the taxes weren't high enough to cause radicalization, but were enough to actually pay for my construction and my industrialization. And so it's very I really did depend on consumption taxes. That's why I don't recommend using authority to suppress. Instead, you should use it to promote, or you get more taxes to make more money, because that will then, of course, allow you to industrialize quicker. Of course, I can get these down lower now, but I think I was doing this to pay off my deficits, as you can see. Normally, I had these on 3 each, but because of the war of China, I'm pretty economically struggling at the moment. You can see here how the GDP sort of went badly wrong with the war of China. It was a very long war because Russia got involved, and I think Persia and the Ottomans. I don't know why. I think they just did. So it was a bit of a nightmare. But financially, we can pay off our deficits. If I wanted to, I could pay it off quicker. But I don't want to increase the radicals right now because, of course, I've just slapped a lot of Chinamen into Japanese influence, and they will not be very happy with me if I were to do anything back, if I were to increase taxation. Of course, construction, I got up to about 802 towards the end of the game. I probably could have done more, but there wasn't really a need to by the nature of my country. And with our biggest states was Kansai over here, with the most expenses and the most money is also coming from Kansai as well. We can take a look here that our buildings are mostly government, tooling workshops, food industry, textile mills. Japan is an all-rounder. You want to be self-sustainable because you have to be self-sustainable. So you will have industries everywhere as Japan. It's a simple product of the times unless you get free trade or mercantilism early, which is very difficult to do. And of course, our buildings, again, it's all about being self-sustainable. So a lot in tools because you need the tools to build up the rest of your industries. A lot in glass for the new sort of late game sort of trade centers. Some telephones to make sure that I was competitive with radios for the new infantry squads and arms industry. Japan is not, you don't specialize in one thing. I mean, you could if you wanted to. You could become a customs union subordinate once you did get mercantilism of one of the greater powers and act like India and pay your way in terms of financial and in terms of sort of resource luxury goods. But if you want to be a self-sustaining standalone nation, then you have to build all this independently. So you can see all of this is independently built. I'm not really trading for any resources, not until the late game. You can see here now I'm trading with resources, but towards the late game I was trading very little with the other powers. And of course, the same with the rural, because you need food and coal. We can see coal is a big one because you can't trade for coal. So eventually, Japan has to move out. So it has to expand to get the coal assets, and it has to expand to get iron. It has to expand to get rubber. So it's very important as Japan that you are in a position to either join a customs union to get those resources, or you are independent enough to function in spite of embargoes or in spite of foreign intervention. So this was a very all-round build. And of course, development, I don't know why it always does this, but I was moving towards squad infantry, and of course, I was moving towards siege artillery and so on and so forth. It's important you do go towards professional army, because if you don't, then your troops will be pretty garbage against other nations. Of course, our trade, we can see our trade goods. We've got a copious amount of services, a lot of wheat. Of course, wheat has gone down substantially, but that's because of the conquest in China. And you can see here that though we have some deficits, it's not too bad. What I found in Japan was you'd build circularly, so it'd be a sort of a circular construction process. So build iron, build tools. All right, what do I need? Build wheat, so build some wheat farms, check this. What do I need? I need clothes, build some clothes. And I made sure all my industries were early to mid game only producing the basic goods. They weren't producing luxury goods, because your demand for these luxury goods is so high that if you try and focus on a expensive industry or luxury goods industry, your own the majority of the population will become radical because you aren't meeting their demands. Of course, our coal has now declined significantly because of our industrialization, because really early to mid game you can get away with the coal you have, but towards the late game you have no choice but to really expand to get hold of coal goods. But where do you expand? It's very difficult to do so. Because as I found with Japan, it was really a case of picking up the sloppy seconds of the great powers. I was industrial. I was advanced enough to go toe to toe with the Russians, but I couldn't go toe to toe with the French or the British militarily or navally. And so often you're sort of having to navigate around these powers. So early on, trying to invade or trying to colonize Africa, keeping up good relations, trying to take these guys, potentially bullying the Netherlands if you can get away with it. And of course, bullying China, because that's one of the few places I can get away with bullying, because I can't really go toe to toe with the other great powers. And of course, now we're beginning to meet the luxury goods demands. We were doing some okay porcelain, but not a lot. Sugar. The really good thing about Japan is it has access to a lot of luxury goods. The only things it doesn't organically have access to is opium and rubber, and well, opium and rubber, and of course some oil to an extent, because it has whaling, but it doesn't have enough oil to be self-sustainable. To actually move over here, no, I didn't. I wonder why I was going for the oil. I think I was trying to push over here for the oil, I believe. If I can remember correctly, I was trying to move over to pinch some oil refineries from Persia towards the end of the game, but it was taking some time. So you can see here, I've gone here for the luxury goods of opium, I've gone over there for the rubber, and of course I've gone over to Borneo and so on and so forth for that gold. So militarily, if we were to look at our military figures, we have a military tech of 5,038. Now, if we compare that to, say, Russia, which is getting beasted right now, yeah, let's compare it with Germany. So we can't go toe to toe with Germans. We can maybe go toe to toe with the French. and we can maybe go toe-to-toe with the British, but navally, I don't think we can go toe-to-toe with them if we go over here, unless the AI is just pants. 905. Yeah, we can't go to toe-to-toe with the British. So that's the thing. Like, I didn't focus on military expansion until I industrialized, really. Once I'd become industrialized and I needed to expand for the resources, that's when I focused on military. Or when I felt like, say, Russia was going to be a threat, that's when I expanded militarily. I didn't really focus on an arms industry or a naval industry until then. Instead, I focused more on the consumer goods and building up the quality of life in my own nation. And of course, weaponry, really, there's not a lot to say. It's a unique play style because you've got to do everything yourself. You've got to become self-sustainable as Japan. So all my stuff is more or less self-sustainable, which Japan can mostly get away with towards the mid to the late game. But because the nature of your politics and your government, and it gives you a refreshing play style. Because whereas you could play as Austria and you can maybe not bother to build a load of coal, and other nations can export coal to you, and you won't notice that you've got a deficit until a war starts, and then you're like, ah, crap, I'm screwed. But as Japan, because you're so isolated and because you've got isolationism, you will notice if you aren't meeting a supply or a good demand, and you will suffer the consequences if you do not meet that demand. Whereas other nations, I feel it's a bit easier to play. But it has its pros and cons. Japan has got lots of good resources to be self-sustainable mid to late game, but also has got a bad economy and a very conservative government, and of course a really weak military, meaning that early to mid game you won't be dictating terms, so to speak. Okay, and then let's take a look at our great power rankings. So if we take a look at great power rankings, we're ahead GDP wise. You can see our GDP has gone pretty well. You can see that big explosion towards the 1900 period. This was mostly due to when I'd ended isolationism. Of course, free trade, everyone was buying my luxury goods, and then we slowly went up from there. We've sort of plateaued here. That was a war with China. Unfortunately, our wars with China did lead to some economic hardship. And I don't know what happened to Germany, and I have no idea what's happened to France or Great Britain, but hey ho. But our quality of life is not very good because we just absorb bits of China. So our quality of life is, of course, not going to be very good at the moment. So that's probably why we're doing so badly. But we've got the third largest population, so it's not the end of the world. And of course, we're behind on prestige. So although we're only third great power in terms of actual financial strength and of course basic military strength, we're we're pretty steadfast. We're pretty high up on the great power chain towards the end. Of course, if I had more time, I would have been able to expand. And you explode as Japan once you do sort of liberalize. But the thing what is holding you back is your lack of is the struggle to liberalize. And so it feels like you're sort of contained until mid to late game. Of course, literacy went up, obviously, because I made a real big push for literacy because I needed to become technologically more advanced. And then, of course, population went up, and of course, radicals have, of course, gone up because of our war with China. Anything else just to really discuss? Well, let's take a look at our population. So we go to our pops. You can see here we have got standard of living at the middle strata isn't too bad, but they have to pay an average of plus 5% of goods. That's not too bad. That's pretty average. Plus 4%, that's below average, I would say, for goods. So I'm quite happy with that. And the upper strata has to pay plus 4% as well. Because, hey ho, not too bad. Really, as a self-contained nation, I can't complain too much. This, I suspect, is mostly due to the Chinese that have just joined our government or joined our nation. And of course, we take a look over here, we can see a very high population of 14 million there, 11 million there, and 15 million in Beijing. So obviously our population demographics are going to rapidly change because of course now we've got 21 million Han population and 40 million Manchu as we expand for the extra worker base. But of course we're now going to have a lot of unemployment now because oh, not too bad, but of course you're going to have some unemployment because because of the rapid expansion into China. Really, China is great for Japan if you can get away with advancing into China. And often I had really bad scores for combat, but because the Chinese had so many men, but because my tech was simply better, I'd win every battle. So it's a bit misleading. The game says you will lose every battle, but actually you can fight 10, 20 to 1 against China once you get to that higher tech level. If you take a look, it says here they've got a tech of 2000, well, a power projection of 2326 compared to my sort of 5038. So hey ho. And of course, in terms of our research, now research is a difficult one, that's just China, because you've got to really balance between everything because you're so far behind on everything. So initially I did basic industry. I increased my basic industry so I could, of course, make my industry more profitable. I didn't really focus on military until sort of the 1880s, 1890s, when I was sort of feeling a bit scared of potential military involvement by foreign powers, because I didn't really have an interest in military expansion until I'd focused on this. So actually, that's a lie. That's a lie. I didn't focus on production first. I first rushed colonialism and then rushed quinine to get hold of the colonies in Africa. At which point, I believe I went down a little bit over here for modern sewage once I saw market access getting too low, and then I focused a lot on production and railways and so on and so forth. And then from there, it was hopping back and forth between the two, with the occasional military tech before leading up to once I was preparing for foreign conquests. That's when I really rushed military tech, or when I compared my military tech to the nations I wanted to conquer. That's when I thought, okay, this is the time to research it. But it was about sort of that education, and it was about, of course, the production. So let's take a look at our demographics again. So if we take a look at our population, look at our culture, we have majority Manchu here, Japanese A and U there. Serbian for some reason over by Japanese Persia, and Japanese and Equatorian Bantu over in Africa, along with Davak and a little bit of Bornean over there. Of course, I did also have some wars with the Spanish, because towards the end of the game I wanted to sort of start moving into the Pacific. So I did in fact take over the Philippines, but then it had a revolution. But because I was at war with China at the time, I couldn't really afford to send troops down there to deal with it, because the Netherlands had joined in to give the Philippines independence. So eventually the Philippines became independent, and I was going to get around to reconquering the Philippines at some date once I'd sort of consolidated Borneo. So if we take a look at our most populous place over here, we can take a look at our demographics. Majority Japanese, and like very little Flemish or Basque or anything to that effect. Now, if we pick a remote, let's take Beijing, for example, majority Han, a little bit of Greek, and so on and so forth. Of course, as our quality of life improved, if we take a look at migrations, we in fact have people migrating to Japan now, which is just organically going to occur because of the quality of life constantly going up. No one's really moving away, as you can see. Of course, we have some turmoil, well, quite a lot of turmoil, but the policing sort of just cancels that out. And also, it's because of the recent war, I've had to put expenses up extremely high. And so that's why you've seen radicals just blow through the roof, which is a bit of a nuisance, but hey, it is what it is. Of course, once we pushed Russia out, Russia sort of began to collapse. You can see radical Russia led by a constitutional empire. They're pretty much collapsing the Russian Empire. Germany, of course, expanded, leaving a little bit of Austrian Baden, a bit of Border Gaul there, a little bit of Bohemia. All happening rather organically, and of course, France has beaten the game once more with a massive empire, while Britain has done very little. I didn't have many wars, but the thing I liked about Japan was you have set targets. Your set targets was, of course, to take the Japanese home islands, then, of course, to secure sort of rare resources, and then, of course, to expand either into the Pacific or expand into China. So it's a very fun nation in that regard, and it's a very unique nation with unique limitations compared to other nations. Now, I don't think anything too badly has happened to any of these sort of nations. No, it's still pretty normal, apart from, of course, United States, which of course has got Mexico in the middle. of its states. I just try not to think about it mildly. But altogether, it's a very fun nation to play. Well, it's boring but fun. If it's boring because you will not be I would treat this, if you were playing Hoi 4, I'd treat this nation like Brazil. It's in the middle of nowhere, no one's going to invade you, no one really cares about you as long as you don't become too much of a nuisance. And you really just do your own thing until the sort of mid to late game. And sort of the same thing as Japan, early to mid game is just building construction tabs and waiting with the occasional reform before eventually sort of growing up or growing out and then expanding towards the late game. And so it can be a bit boring for a lot of people. I mean, I thought it was a bit repetitive, just going to 5 speed a lot of the time, while my construction did most of the work, and it's going, okay, I gotta do this, gotta do this, gotta do this. But it was still a pretty fun one because I liked isolationism. I liked um, the challenges isolationism gives you, the fact that you can't depend on other nations for those resources, the fact that you've got to keep good relations with other powers because you're technology backwards in regards to the other greater powers. It's a very interesting nation to play as because you start off extremely weak, but you can become extremely influential and important towards the mid to late game because of those luxury goods. Once you do open your markets, if you do have a luxury goods industry, which I do, if we take a look at my luxury goods industry, you can make a killing on the markets with cotton, dye, opium. Well, opium because I took that tells you over here. Tea, because you've got those luxury goods in your nation to begin with, you can make a killing on the open markets if you were inclined to build up that way. And so you can explode financially. But it also makes you vulnerable to other powers seeking to take you over for access to those goods. So you do have to bear in mind that if you run the risk of being eaten in to get hold of those luxury resources. So some of the politics was increasing relations with other powers. You can see here I am increasing relations with some powers just to make sure none of them get any ideas with me. But once you do expand, it can be really fun, and I did enjoy the nation playing Japan. I think Isolation is quite a nice nation, quite a nice concept, and of course I liked the it's starting to position. The only thing I didn't really like was, of course, the waiting as you waited to reform. I suspect there may be optimal cheese routes to become liberal extremely quickly, but if you did it organically like I did, then of course you'll be spending a large proportion of the time waiting. But of course, it can lead to eventually powder kegs occurring. I don't know if it's a multiplayer game. If it's a multiplayer game, you're probably going to get eaten. You're probably going to be forced into a customs union by either Russia or United States or Great Britain because you are an extremely profitable route source of luxury goods. I mean, Britain doesn't have to take you, but may just decide to take you to deprive other powers of those luxury goods. And altogether, a pretty fun nation to play as. I would definitely recommend giving this nation a go if you want to see the challenges of a conservative government and want to see how a minor nation performs in terms of how it has to meet the demands of its population while also trying to become a self-sustaining power. It's a fun nation, and I highly recommend giving it a go. But really, that's all I have to say. I mean, it's a pretty fun nation to play as. Because it's different. It's different to say Germany or Austria or France, Great Britain. It's very different in how you approach your economy. Instead of us saying, I will be the silk producer of the world, you can't do that as Japan. You've got to be a bit of everything, which means that towards a late game you can be very independent if you so choose, and if you can get a hold of those sort of extra resources. But that's it for me, boys and girls. I'll be doing another after action report of Austria, and then I think the next time you see me, it will probably be me doing a playthrough of the new DLC for either Unity Command 2 or, of course, Gates of Hell. But thank you all for watching. I hope you've had a good one, And oh yeah, and another thing, get rid of taxation. Like you can't stay on. You got to push to either proportional or per capita. Um, Eventually, because as your nation and demographics change, you're going to eventually end up in deficit from the land-based taxation. So you will have to push down here, but which is quite difficult to do. But eventually, if you weaken the shogun enough, but organically, you can get away with it. But that's it, boys and girls. Thank you all for watching, and I will see you all later. Adieu.